Hello YouTube, welcome back to Nutkin Farm. 6 years in, and I never get sick of the view of this place. But in spring, and this is late September 2025, it's especially nice when you see the trees having such a good time flowering. These are the 344s in block 2 that had a whole lot of pre-season flowering. But as you can see, they had a bunch more in reserve for flowering just when they were meant to. So despite being very pessimistic about what 344s would do this year, it looks like mine have decided to make an effort. What you're seeing here is the end of the flowering, so where they're starting to go brown, and you're hoping, against hope, that some of these have been pollinated and will turn into nuts. And as I mentioned in a recent video, it seems to have been a long flowering season rather than a short one. And I'd love some of the boffins to work out how we can tell when it's going to be a long or short flowering season, because it would help people plan things, particularly in terms of protecting that flower with either fungicides or pesticide for lacebug, or both, because timing those things is always tricky. And even experienced neighbours like Peter Fraser tell me that there's often an element of luck, more so than science. But yeah, to know that we were going to have a flowering season like this in advance would be an advantage. And I'd love to hear from you, wherever you are in Australia, about how your flowering season has gone, because there's a lot of people who put hope in flowering. Obviously, without flower, there isn't nuts. There's a long way to go now between flowering and nuts, but at least the start looks promising. Now, other than flowering time of the year, it's another time of the year, and I'm going to make this a regular thing, so long as I just keep doing these videos for you and you keep liking them. The benchmark report has come out for the Australian macadamia industry for 2024. It's always a year behind, and you could expect that to happen. You've got to cast your mind back. Oh, what was it like for the crop that dropped in 2024? Because our memories are always, of course, more firmly fixed on the season that's just passed. So by 2024 season, I mean the nut that dropped in 2024. So the season really starts in spring 23. But that season, where the nuts dropped in 2024, the results have come in from the benchmarking program, which is run by New South Wales and Queensland governments and Hort Innovation and a bunch of other people, and participated in by enough macadamia farmers to represent about half of all macadamia crops in Australia. So it's a pretty good representative sample if you want to find out what's going on in the Australian macadamia industry. Some of them are basically surveys of the farmers, and one of the questions they asked them were, what were the factors limiting your production in 2024? And the top two answers were wet weather by a mile, and daylight second really, but the second one was pests. And they are fairly regular complaints from Australian macadamia farmers. So, over the years, that has often been the complaint about limiting factors. Obviously, in the drought year, they wouldn't have been, the wet weather one wouldn't have featured much. But yeah, there it is. They also asked the farmers, what were your top pests? And that varied between regions. And I should pause for a second, let you know that the results are divvied up between 4 main macadamia growing regions in the country. That is Central Queensland, Bundaberg, Southeast Queensland, which is like the Glasshouse Mountains and Gold Coast area, Northern Rivers of New South Wales, and finally the mid-north coast of New South Wales. Now, for those of you left out in far north Queensland or in Western Australia, I'm sorry, I recognise you. These benchmarks are probably designed to require enough statistical input to make it significant, and so they've gone with the ones with the greatest numbers. Funnily enough, the greatest crop comes out of central Queensland, but the greatest numbers of benchmark participants are in the northern rivers, and we'll get into why perhaps in a second. Anyway, back to the top pests. Central Queensland was very, very bent on the fruit spotting bug. It's their top pest. And look, it's a top pest here in New South Wales as well, but relatively more so in central Queensland. The Northern Rivers farmers were more concerned about rats this year, relatively, but you know it's still second after fruit spotting bug. Rats are a problem in every growing district, but the Northern Rivers farmers had particular issues with them, which is interesting. Macadamia nut borer, the Christmas pest. It was more of a concern, funnily enough, in central Queensland. So the Bundaberg farmers have a lot of problem with nut borer, less so in New South Wales and further south. In the mid-north coast, funnily enough, a relatively larger pest was birds. And by that, I believe they mean the black cockatoos, who are vandalous birds that can sit up in trees and bite nuts off just for fun. They don't eat the nuts, they're just vandals. And they're very pretty birds, but if they start chewing your crop off and screaming at it as it falls down the tree, that obviously means less profit for the farmer. And of course, birds are something you can do the least about, particularly when they're a protected species. So that was Mid-North Coast's relatively larger complaint, but they all had roughly the same complaints. They asked the farmers, what were your top disease concerns? And this one was uniform across all the regions. Phytophthora, so the root disease that affects macadamia trees. I've often said that the root system is the macadamia's weak point. They're trying to develop better root stocks to resist Phytophthora, but it's a soil pathogen. It's always in the soil. It's really more a question of whether your tree is strong enough to resist it and fight back. So it's not really just a matter of spraying the tree trunks with phosphonic acid in order to try and treat the Phytophthora. You've really got to have the right conditions for the tree to beat it off by itself. And there's different ways of doing that. I like the nutritional approach that involves silica because Phytophthora is a big problem in avocados as well. And they're using silica-based solutions to try and strengthen up the tree. Not really catching on in macadamias yet, but watch this space. So how about the cropping? How many tonnes a hectare was everyone getting? Well, the average of all Australian farms participating in the benchmark for 2024 was up a bit. It was about 3 tonnes a hectare, up from 2.8 the previous year. Now, I mean, to me, that's a pretty good effort. I'd be happy with 3 tonnes a hectare off Nutkin, although Nutkin has some work still remaining to be done. The regions were interesting. So central Queensland, the Bundaberg farms, came in first place with 3.4 tonnes a hectare, followed by Northern Rivers with 2.7, Southeast Queensland with 2.3, and Mid-North Coast with about 2.3. That's the sort of top line figure for nut in shell. When it comes down to kernel, the actual kernels in the nuts and how much weight of kernel was produced per farm, the results got a lot closer. So what we're seeing is that some of the southern areas, while they're producing fewer nuts in terms of overall nut in shell tonnage, the actual kernel tonnage only varied by a small amount between all of those regions. So it tended to even up. That's less interesting for farmers because farmers are paid by nut in shell. But it is interesting to the rest of the industry and the nut processors who obviously want to sell kernel to people. It certainly doesn't mean that central Queensland is the only place to grow macadamias. You can get very high kernel recovery results out of those southern areas as well, and that can make up for the lack of nut in shell. So I found that pretty interesting. Now, the total saleable kernel recovery, SKR, was a record high in 2024. It was up to an average of 35.3%, up from 35 the previous year, and 35 was pretty high already. So, well, it's not an absolute record. It's the highest since 2018, which got, I think, marginally higher for kernel recovery. But very interesting there. I mean, it may reflect the fact that some of the plantings are transferring to the newer varieties that do have higher kernel recovery, or perhaps we're getting better at growing macadamias. Maybe the results in terms of targeted nutrition, the switch to organic nutrition, maybe those things are turning up in kernel recovery. But yeah, the highest since 2018, and I wouldn't have thought 2024 season was that great a season for growing nuts. So that's interesting. How about the profits farmers make? I mean, after all, we're not here for a haircut. The nice thing about 2024, looking back on it, is that margins returned to positive. So after being unprofitable in 2023, so farmers were losing $2,383 a hectare in 2023. Per tonne of nut in shell, not per hectare. It got back to positive $385 a tonne for nut in shell in 2024. Now, that's not enough to feed you, not unless you eat very, very cheap things, but at least it was heading in the right direction. And if you're wondering what the profit per tonne was like in the headier days where prices were high, well, in 2020, the profit per tonne was $3,515 per tonne of nut in shell. Those are the days we'd like to get back to, of course, although we're not quite there yet. You'd imagine that the 2025 season, just gone, will be a better result for farmers financially, but that's something we won't find out till about September 2026. Anyway, look, the margin's moving back in the right direction. It does also show in the macadamia farm market, I have to say, because there isn't a lot for sale in macadamia farms, and there's at least 2 or 3 people I know who are on the lookout to buy macadamia farms and really can't find anything decent. So there is that. There is still a couple of farms being demolished, and I really don't know why they would be doing that, but that's a story for another time. One bit of trivia for you. How big is the average macadamia farm? Do you ever think of that? Well, the answer varies by region, and the benchmarking test gave us a little bit of an answer there. In terms of planted hectares, never mind whether they're bearing or not, but in terms of planted hectares, the average farm size in central Queensland is 110 hectares. So that's a big farm. Next is southeast Queensland with 43. Northern Rivers, 27 hectares. That's your average farm in the Northern Rivers. And the mid-north coast, the smallest of all, at 18 hectares. So those numbers are interesting. I mean, I was aware that some of the mid-north coast farms on fairly valuable land were likely to be smaller. The average cost per tonne of nut in shell is interesting as well. Now, the benchmark figures also go in terms of cost per planted hectare, but I think the more relevant test for you and I is how much does it take to produce a tonne of nuts? However many hectares you use, what does it cost to produce a tonne of nuts? Because it's what you get paid for a tonne of nuts that matters at the end of the day. Well, the cheapest cost per tonne of nut in shell was actually southeast Queensland. So yay, the Glasshouse Mountains, they came in at $3,049 a tonne. The Northern Rivers came second with $3,424 a tonne. Central Queensland jumped up a little bit, $3,631 a tonne. And finally, the mid-north coast, $4,461 a tonne. So there are some cost issues in the Northern Rivers. in the mid-north coast. Is that due to the small farm size? Is there perhaps a lack of critical mass in terms of some of the support industries, meaning that they cost more? I don't know. If you have a mid-north coast farm, let me know what it is. Perhaps there's a higher level of investment going on in recent years, but it would be interesting to find out. Well, that's the report card for 2024, guys. Short and sweet. I'll be back in touch with you again very soon. Look forward to talking with you. Please add your comments if you want to contribute to the discussion. Bye for now.